I decided to study psychology and behavioral neuroscience because I'm a target parent, and I became interested in conducting research in personality disorders, more specifically in the biological correlates of personality disorders. And I decided to combine the two with my experience doing pro bono domestic violence representation to understand the role of personality disorders in parental alienation cases as well as in domestic violence generally. Recently I had been working with the late Dr. Stephen Miller, and he and I were going to start conducting research on the role of personality disorders, more specifically borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder in parental alienation cases, particularly as alienating parents having those conditions and how those conditions impact outcomes of parental alienation cases, prognosis of reunification, etc. Cluster B personality disorders are rarely what we call naked personality disorders or sole existing personality disorders. They're often comorbid with each other. So it's not uncommon for someone with borderline personality disorder to present, for example, with histrionic personality disorder, or someone with narcissistic personality disorder to also present with borderline. And those comorbidities complicate treatment, prognosis, diagnosis, etc. And on top of that, many people with personality disorders have comorbidities in the axis 1 spectrum of disorders, anxiety disorders, PTSD, for example, somatoform or conversion disorders are not uncommon, particularly in borderlines. And when you get that kind of cluster of psychopathology in a custody case, often trying to unpack that cluster of psychopathology can give you insight as to where the case might end up, what's likely to be a good, successful intervention in that kind of case. There's a lot of research that points to the likely presence of personality disorders in parental alienation cases. There is very little research that actually explores it robustly. Like, what's the incidence of a certain personality disorder in alienating parents, for example, and that's the type of work that I want to get into. And to combine it with my PhD research, which is on the behavioral neuroscience side of things, so always looks at the biological correlates of behavior, and in this case, certain conduct and personality disorders. Borderline personality disorder, as an example, can be transgenerational from at minimum 2 different perspectives. One is there's a genetic component to the plurality of behaviors that comprise the disorder. Many alienating parents grew up in an invalidating environment. They have a trauma history. And they sometimes can transfer that invalidating behavior to their own children as part of the alienating behaviors. And then those children can then inculcate those behaviors and transfer them on to their children. So there's a biological component and there's an environmental component. And you can intervene on the environmental side. It's difficult to intervene on the biological side. Personality disorders are not absolute. They're what's called polygenic. And that means that there's a lot of genes that impart liability on the disorder, and each gene only has a small effect on that liability. But the combination of these genetic markers can increase the risk factors associated with having the disorder and passing it on to your children. But then environmental factors can often bring these up to a level of threshold where they become pathological. A proper diagnosis has to occur by a clinician, and a proper diagnosis is done by both looking at the whole clinical picture, so looking at the case history, the clinical history, gathering evidence and facts, but also conducting psychometric and instrument testing to determine whether that diagnosis is appropriate and what the diagnosis is, something called differential diagnosis. So particularly if you have someone who's comorbid with multiple personality disorders, you need to have instruments that can differentiate between one and the other. The question comes to mind then, should you diagnose a parental alienation case, the parents, and particularly the alienating parents? Should you order a diagnosis? Can a judge order a diagnosis? How does the other parent ask for a diagnosis? Is it appropriate in a legal case to even have a diagnosis entered into evidence or a finding of a borderline, for example, diagnosis? What would you do with that information? I don't think many judges would want to order a diagnosis or accept a diagnosis as evidence that a borderline parent is incompetent. And that is because you could have someone with a personality disorder that can be rehabilitated. You can't treat what you don't diagnose, right? A doctor would not treat cancer without diagnosing it. So it begs the question, why don't you diagnose a personality disorder in a PA case in order to order a treatment or an intervention that is actually likely to be successful? And with borderlines, it's a perfect example, because you can, if you properly diagnose a disorder, you can then have insight into what the prognosis of a therapeutic intervention would be, and you can potentially identify the appropriate therapeutic intervention for that type of condition if you can accurately differentially diagnose it. The question is, a proper diagnosis would be very expensive in most cases, and in many cases where neither parent has the financial wherewithal and the court wouldn't pay for it, then it's unlikely to be something that could happen. But there is an argument that can be made that a diagnosis would be useful to a court to inform the court on how it can address the problems before it. Not necessarily to label a parent as having a personality disorder, because it is possible to have a personality disorder and be an excellent parent. So you don't want to stigmatize people in that way. But you can diagnose a personality disorder to give information as to how you can address the problem. What I would call an egocentric borderline, that's someone that doesn't have insight into their illness. They may not. If they're fully immersed in their projection, if they're fully immersed in their dissociation, if they're fully immersed in transient delusional states, they may not have insight that what they're doing is child abuse, that they're actually harming their child. And maybe they may be so severe that they're convinced from their delusions that they are protecting the child by projecting behaviors that aren't actually occurring by the other parent. And in that context, they may not be aware that they're abusing the child. But it's difficult to identify where that line is between a delusional belief and an intentional affirmative behavior which is abusive to a child. And I don't think many judges or even therapists or clinicians are equipped to find where that line is. You can even diagnose a borderline. That doesn't mean that you're able to tell every time when they're doing something that they truly believe, or whether they're doing something that they know is wrong, or where they're doing something that they're in denial that it's wrong. And it's hard to identify what bucket those behaviors fall into. They all constitute child abuse. Just because someone has a mental disorder, for example, does not typically excuse them from criminal liability, right? The problem is that in a severe case, if a parent presents with egocentric borderline personality disorder, for example, or narcissistic personality disorder, where they have no insight, they are typically unwilling to go into therapy, unwilling to go into treatment. And if they do go into treatment, they are likely going to drop out at a very high rate. The system should try to address the psychopathology that they have, but that parent has to be willing to undergo therapy and to engage in it to get their child back. The parents, however, that do acknowledge that they have a personality disorder and are willing to go into therapy, I think that courts should look into helping that parent, because the child will be better off with not only both parents, but with healthy parents, mentally healthy parents. If they have no insight into their disorder, should they have visitation? I think many courts could give them supervised visitation. So in a context of supervised visitation, you have someone who's monitoring the situation, and if that parent is violating boundaries or violating court orders, and often the two are the same, then they can terminate the visitation. If they can manage the situation, it's not impossible that you can have successful visitation with a severely disordered parent. And I'm talking about those very rare cases of severe alienators, severe personality disorders, where that, I think, would be a good outcome. In many cases, however, they can't behave themselves even in a supervised setting. On the one hand, I don't think you can prevent parental alienation, just like you cannot prevent a personality disorder, unless you diagnose early before the behaviors start and you go into treatment. You can certainly manipulate the environment of a child to minimize a personality disorder manifesting as a consequence of even biological risk factors, but there's only so much you can do. Not all people that grow up in an invalidating environment grow up to be borderlines, for example. In most parental alienation cases, though, moderate and modest parental alienation, I think you can prevent it. One of the ways you can prevent it is by simply educating parents on the impact of certain what look like innocuous behaviors to the parent on the child. We'll say to their kids, if they fall down and they scratch their knee, you're fine, it doesn't hurt, right? That's a well-meaning, well-intentioned comment from a parent. But if the parent does it constantly, every time, and if the parent does it in every circumstance, when a child feels some pain, for example, and the parent says, no, that's not really what you're feeling, that's invalidating the child's own inner experience. And at some point, developmentally, especially if you start doing that early, the child starts to question their own self-talk, their own sense of self and their inner experience. And they start to look to the rest of the world to tell them how they're feeling. That is the genesis of a borderline from an environmental perspective. They don't understand that there's a loyalty conflict that they are creating. And many parents, once told, if you do that, it's going to put your son or daughter in a position of, oh, do I need to take sides? Or do I need to believe mom over dad or dad over mom? If you just don't discuss it with your child, you don't put them in that predicament.